The architecture of modern economics rests on foundations built from profound failure. The most significant financial cataclysm of the 20th century was not merely a market correction. It was a societal realignment, an event that redefined the relationship between a government, its people, and the mechanisms of capital. This was a period where fortunes, built over generations, were obliterated not by conflict or natural disaster, but by a catastrophic failure of the financial system itself. Individuals who began their day as affluent members of society concluded it in financial ruin. An estimated $200 billion in value evaporated, plunging the United States into a decade defined by profound scarcity, ecological disaster, and widespread human suffering. To comprehend the fall, we must first analyze the flawed foundations of the speculative party that preceded it. The year is 1922. The Great War has concluded, and with its end, the nation's industrial military apparatus pivots. The machinery of conflict is retooled for the machinery of convenience. Factories that once produced artillery and tanks now dedicate their assembly lines to a new wave of consumer durables: electric toasters, vacuum cleaners, and mechanical refrigerators that rendered the old icebox a symbol of an antiquated past. This was the Roaring Twenties, a period of intense and visible economic expansion. The physical landscape of the nation transformed. New York City's skyline, fueled by new engineering techniques and vast capital, ascended with unprecedented speed. Simultaneously, a new cultural soundtrack emerged. Jazz, a complex and distinctly American art form, permeated the urban airwaves, becoming the defining sound of the era. It was pervasive, energetic, and, much like the financial instruments soon to follow, widely embraced but poorly understood by the masses. This economic boom fostered a dangerous strain of societal optimism. A pervasive belief took hold that the nation had entered a new era of permanent prosperity. This sentiment was not confined to the general public. It was validated and amplified by prominent academic and financial voices. Respected economists of the period publicly declared that the economy had reached a permanently high plateau, effectively endorsing the speculative fervor and assuring the public that the growth trajectory was fundamentally sound and irreversible. At the core of this growth was a revolution in manufacturing, championed by Henry Ford. The implementation of the moving assembly line was not merely an innovation, it was a paradigm shift. Production time for a single Model T automobile collapsed, dropping from over 12 hours to a mere 90 minutes. This radical efficiency gain unleashed the automobile upon the American landscape. The resulting demand surge created a powerful positive feedback loop. The automotive sector's explosive growth pulled ancillary industries along with it. Steel, petroleum, rubber, and glass manufacturing expanded rapidly, creating jobs and investment opportunities. The American economy was not simply growing, it was accelerating, fueled by a new model of mass production and mass consumption. As urban centers flourished, bathed in electric light and luxury, the adoption of new technology became a marker of modernity. The radio, in particular, transformed from a niche hobbyist device into a ubiquitous piece of household furniture. By 1929, 10 million American homes possessed a radio set. This new medium created a homogenized national culture, broadcasting entertainment, news, and, significantly, commercial advertising directly into private homes. However, this portrait of urban prosperity was dangerously incomplete. It masked a deep and worsening structural crisis in rural America. While city dwellers embraced consumerism, the nation's farmers were collapsing under the weight of the post-war bust. Agricultural prices, once inflated by wartime demand, had plummeted. In a desperate bid to maintain income, farmers invested heavily in mechanization, adopting new tractors and combines. This modernization was financed almost entirely by debt. Instead of salvation, the new technology often only hastened their insolvency, increasing their output while prices continued to fall. This rural debt crisis was mirrored by a new phenomenon in the cities, the explosion of consumer credit. Urban America discovered a potent new economic tool: installment buying. The buy now, pay later philosophy became normalized. Automobiles, radios, and household appliances were no longer purchased with savings. They were acquired through financing. Financial institutions, eager to capitalize on this new market, aggressively extended installment plans to nearly anyone, often with minimal underwriting. This practice fundamentally shifted the consumer balance sheet. It fueled short-term demand by pulling future consumption into the present, layering a new, precarious stratum of private debt onto the economy. But the true epicenter of this speculative mania was not in the department stores, it was on Wall Street. The stock market detached from its function as a mechanism for capital investment and transformed into a national casino. The primary fuel for this speculation was the widespread availability of buying on margin. This financial leverage allowed an individual to purchase stock, valued at $100, for a mere $10 down payment. The remaining $90 was a loan from the broker. This system was predicated on a single, unchallenged assumption that stock prices would, and must, only move upward. The speculative fervor broke containment from the financial elite and infected the entire social fabric. It was a sign of systemic risk when traditional metrics of expertise were inverted. Barbers, shoeshine boys, and bellhops, individuals with no financial training, were actively dispensing stock tips, convinced of their own infallible insights. This democratization of speculation was not a sign of widespread prosperity. It was a symptom of a profound detachment from economic reality. Between 1924 and 1929, the Dow Jones Industrial Average quadrupled. Market valuation had become completely decoupled from fundamental corporate earnings. The vibes, as the source script noted, had replaced profits as the primary metric. This speculative bubble was further inflated by dubious corporate structures. Companies created complex holding companies, which owned other holding companies, which in turn often held no tangible assets whatsoever. Their value was derived purely from stock market hype and financial engineering. Warnings from skeptical voices, like economist Roger Babson, who explicitly warned of an impending crash in 1929, were dismissed. The market responded to his pessimism with yet another rally, as the sound of optimism and easy money drowned out all dissent. Behind the veneer of prosperity, the structural cracks were becoming fissures. Agricultural debt was at unsustainable levels. Consumer debt had ballooned. The entire economy was leveraged, precariously balanced. On October 29, 1929, the assumption of permanent prosperity collided with reality. The day, immortalized as Black Tuesday, was not a simple decline. It was a total structural failure. The market ceased to function. It became a cascade of sell orders with no corresponding buyers. The Dow Jones Industrial Average did not just fall, it evaporated. Ticker tape machines, unable to keep pace with the volume of transactions, ran hours behind, spitting out a relentless stream of devastating losses. On the floor of the exchange, the mechanisms of finance dissolved into human panic. $14 billion in paper wealth vanished in a single day. When adjusted for inflation, this figure represented a loss exceeding $200 billion in modern terms. This was not abstract capital. It represented the tangible savings of millions, the endowments of universities, the capitalization of businesses, and the entire architecture of personal and corporate hopes. The Roaring Twenties had not just concluded, they had imploded, taking the nation's retirement savings with them. The crash initiated a devastating chain reaction, and the first domino was the margin call. The leverage that had magnified gains now magnified losses exponentially. The $90 that brokers had loaned for every $100 of stock was now due, immediately. But the stock that secured the loan was now worth perhaps $50, or $30, or less. Investors were forced to sell their remaining assets to cover the call, which pushed prices down further, triggering more margin calls. It was a self-perpetuating vortex of liquidation. Those who were millionaires on paper on Monday were rendered utterly bankrupt by Thursday. The banking executives who had fueled the boom now confronted balance sheets that were incomprehensible, filled with assets that were suddenly entirely worthless. The crisis then metastasized from Wall Street to Main Street. The banking system, which had appeared as a pillar of institutional trust, was revealed to be hollow. These institutions had not just loaned money to speculators, they had speculated with their own depositors' money. When their stock market investments imploded, their assets were wiped out, but their liabilities, the savings of ordinary citizens, remained. As the first banks failed, a psychological panic, a contagion of fear, spread through the public. This triggered the phenomenon of the bank run. Crowds of terrified depositors descended on their local branches, demanding their life savings in cash. The banks, which operate on a fractional reserve system, could not possibly honor all withdrawals. Locked doors and desperate reassurances from tellers did nothing to stop the panic. One failure triggered another, and then another. Thousands of banks collapsed, taking the entire life savings of millions of families with them. The catastrophe was not contained within American borders. It became a global contagion. Panicked U.S. banks, desperate for liquidity, called in their high-risk loans to European institutions, particularly in Germany and Austria, which were still fragile from the First World War. The collapse of the Austrian Bank Kreditanstalt in 1931 triggered a wave of European bank failures. Global trade, the artery of the world economy, seized. Compounded by disastrous protectionist policies, international trade volume collapsed by more than half within 3 years. In the face of this escalating systemic failure, the initial response from leadership was one of profound denial. Headlines attempted to frame the collapse as a mere correction. Political and financial leaders, including President Herbert Hoover, appeared publicly to assure the nation that the fundamental business of the country is on a sound and prosperous basis. These assurances, measured against the reality of bank failures and mass unemployment, sounded hollow and demonstrated a complete disconnect from the suffering of the populace. The system was not adjusting, it was disintegrating. By 1931, the denial had given way to a stark new reality. The financial crash had fully transitioned into a societal depression. The national unemployment rate reached an unthinkable 25%. This statistic meant that 1 in every 4 active members of the workforce could not find employment of any kind. The industrial heartland was silent. In Detroit, the epicenter of the automotive boom, production had collapsed by 75%. The vast, innovative factories that had defined American progress were shuttered. In the cities, the mechanisms of charity and local relief were overwhelmed. Bread lines and soup kitchens, serving thin soup and stale bread, became the primary source of nutrition for millions. Reports from teachers became common, detailing students fainting in classrooms not from illness, but from sustained malnutrition. The social fabric itself began to tear. The suicide rate surged. Marriage and birth rates plummeted as the future was too uncertain to support new families. And in a cruel confluence of events, the economic crisis was compounded by an ecological one. In the Great Plains, decades of unsustainable farming practices, stripping the land of its native grasses for wheat production, had left the topsoil exposed. When a severe drought cycle began, the soil turned to powder. The winds came, lifting that soil into the sky, creating monstrous, black blizzards that blotted out the sun for days. This was the Dust Bowl. It buried farms, suffocated livestock, and rendered millions of acres of farmland useless. A massive internal migration began. Hundreds of thousands of Okies, displaced families from Oklahoma, Kansas, and Arkansas, packed their meager belongings onto dilapidated vehicles and headed west, chasing a rumor of work in California. They arrived not as pioneers, but as climate and economic refugees, often finding only more hardship. In Washington, the Hoover administration adhered rigidly to an economic philosophy of rugged individualism. President Hoover believed that direct federal aid, a dole, would corrupt the American character, and that recovery must come from private charity and local government. He authorized large-scale public works projects, most notably the Hoover Dam, but these were insufficient to counteract the deflationary spiral. His refusal to deploy the full power of the federal government to provide direct relief made him a symbol of the very suffering he seemed unable to address. The public's bitterness manifested in the language of the era. Shanty towns built from scrap metal and cardboard on the edges of cities were bitterly named Hoovervilles. Newspapers used for warmth were Hoover blankets. An empty pocket turned inside out was a Hoover flag. The political nadir arrived in the summer of 1932. Thousands of desperate World War I veterans, known as the Bonus Army, marched on Washington, D.C. They were demanding the early payment of a service bonus scheduled for payout decades in the future. They were destitute, and they needed the money immediately. They established a peaceful, organized encampment near the Capitol. When Congress rejected their demands, the Hoover administration made a fatal decision. The United States Army, under the command of General Douglas MacArthur, was dispatched to clear the camp. Using tear gas, bayonets, and cavalry, the army drove its own veterans from the capital, burning their makeshift shelters. The image of the federal government using military force against its own impoverished, unarmed heroes signaled a profound crisis of legitimacy. Radical ideologies gained traction, not from theoretical appeal, but from the raw hunger created by capitalism's failure. Bank robbers became folk heroes, seen as striking back against the very institutions that had betrayed the public trust. By March of 1933, the nation was functionally paralyzed. It was into this atmosphere of despair that Franklin Delano Roosevelt assumed the presidency. His inaugural address was a masterful stroke of psychological warfare against the Depression itself. He famously declared, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself, nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror." This statement was more than rhetoric. It was a direct confrontation with the psychological paralysis that had frozen the economy. It signaled a fundamental shift in philosophy, from passive observance to active intervention. Roosevelt's administration immediately launched a series of bold experimental programs known as the New Deal. The Civilian Conservation Corps, or CCC, mobilized hundreds of thousands of young, unemployed men into a civilian army. They were sent to national forests to plant trees, fight erosion, and build parks, sending their paychecks home to their families. The Works Progress Administration, or WPA, followed, hiring millions to construct public infrastructure, roads, bridges, schools, and post offices. Crucially, these programs were not a dole. They were jobs. They did not just restore the nation's infrastructure, they aimed to restore the dignity of the workforce. In the Tennessee Valley, the TVA brought massive dams and electrification to one of the poorest regions in the country, fundamentally altering the economic landscape. Roosevelt did not merely treat the symptoms, he sought to restructure the financial system that had failed. His administration established permanent regulatory architecture. The Securities and Exchange Commission, or SEC, was created to impose rules and transparency on Wall Street, ending the casino-like practices of the 1920s. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, or FDIC, was established to insure individual bank deposits, ensuring that a bank failure would never again wipe out the savings of ordinary citizens. Perhaps most monumentally, the passage of Social Security created a foundational social safety net. It provided a modest pension for the elderly and unemployment insurance, establishing a new permanent federal responsibility for the economic well-being of its citizens. The recovery was slow, halting, and incomplete. Unemployment remained stubbornly high throughout the 1930s, but the New Deal, including its support for the arts through the Federal Arts Project, helped the nation endure. Culture, from the stark realism of Dorothea Lange's Migrant Mother photograph to the pure escapism of Hollywood's The Wizard of Oz, processed the national trauma. The Great Depression did not truly end with a single piece of legislation or a return to normalcy. Full economic recovery was only achieved by the massive, involuntary government stimulus of global conflict. As the decade closed, the factories of America began to hum again, louder than ever. But they were not just producing automobiles. They were producing helmets, munitions, and the materiel for a new world war. The nation, having survived its greatest internal economic failure, was now mobilizing to confront the greatest external threat of the 20th century. The lessons of this era are not history, they are mechanisms. Understanding them is critical. If you value this analysis, subscribe to the channel, engage with this content, leave your insights in the comments below.